So my name is Nick Van Weerdenburg. I'm the CEO of Rangle.io. We are a modern JavaScript consultancy. We focus on full stack JavaScript, but we also do a lot of front end engineering with companies that are building a new front end that's a single page application or a browser centric app. And so today's talk is meant to share some of our experiences over the last 18 months, helping companies move to Angular, Backbone, React, in some cases Node, and really talk about what companies have been going through and how to modernize their technology and, ideally not go out of business, because there's a huge impact to any kind of technology rewrite. Most of them fail. Modernizing your technology can be done strategically and elegantly, but there are a few sort of catches as well. So as I was explaining earlier, we're a full stack next generation JavaScript and HTML5 consultancy, so we only focus on the modern next generation web. We have 24 Angular, Backbone, React, and Node developers, plus our UX, QA, and Scrum Master teams, and we have done over 20 modern JavaScript projects in the last 18 months, many with client backends built in Java, Rails, PHP, Python, and .NET. And we engage with a lot of different clients. Our mission is to help them move to the next generation web. So sometimes we're partnered with their developers, working as a joint team. Sometimes we're doing the front end while they do the back end. Sometimes we're just doing training and consulting. So we've seen a wide variety of companies moving over to the next generation web. So why modernize? That's obviously the first question, and this is something companies have been able to put off in the past, but it's become really urgent more recently for a few reasons. HTML5, it's now everywhere, so there's this amazing browser platform that you can rely on for building your apps. That changes the game significantly because you can make significant architectural changes, such as working with Angular or other browser-centric application technologies. There's also the impact of mobile, so companies have to update their web for a mobile web experience, and to do that as a separate application isn't a great solution in the long run when mobile traffic is crossing 50%. It's got to be a first-class citizen. And finally, there's the design and user experience revolution, where people are expecting good user experiences from their software, and it's a competitive advantage. And there's also a lot of simplification going on in the market, where new categories are being created by doing a few things really good, really well, and with strong support for mobile. So this is really a perfect storm because there's three pains that are all coming together, and there's the opportunity to use the HTML5 platform, and it's a perfect storm for new technologies overtaking the old. Modern JavaScript and CSS solutions provide a huge user experience improvement opportunity for companies, and large code bases in the browser demand a new approach to architecting the front end, and that's one of the reasons that it's also worth doing and rethinking more thoroughly, because you do have this new architecture which offers a lot of advantages in terms of having your code well written and maintainable and extendable and supporting mobile and the regular web. But modernization is extremely expensive. A lot of companies have failed to do this, moving from DOS to Windows or from Windows to the web. No new features potentially for existing clients for 18 months. Long break between releases makes users and companies wonder what's going on. You don't feel like a going concern anymore, and they might start looking at some of the fancier, newer, shiny things. So often, and we'll talk about this later, an important part of a modernization program is to communicate with the users and get them involved early. And then finally, you have reduced sales as clients wait for a new version, and this can generate a death spiral. But what often happens is companies don't actually even get to this. They have the plan, they have it in work, they have 10, 20 developers, they have 5 working on it, 2 get pulled off to work on current issues. There's a new release that's required for a new market. There's a competitive sort of movement in the market where they released a feature, and in the chaos of that, there's just no continual focus on this. And I saw this a lot in different markets I worked in the enterprise space, where companies had a web version, but it was anemic. It was just horrible, and they were still putting most of their development resources into their older software. And so, the point, or one of the points of this webinar, is that this fate's been realized many times over, and to have a very strong modernization strategy to be able to do it effectively is critical for companies when these disruptions come along. And all of those DOS-based or thick client-based applications ultimately got replaced by web versions, and very few companies made that transition effectively, except for the very big ones who had a lot of client buy-in to the technology. And so this is also very risky. There's a high risk of failure. Getting alignment of stakeholders is challenging. Getting a CEO to understand the importance of this, getting the sales team to understand this. There's a new architecture for single-page or browser-centric applications. And the language is essentially new with advanced JavaScript, which has a lot of differences from what people are used to. Doing a large code base with JavaScript with a functional type architecture is a huge change, and most people aren't experienced with that. They struggle going from object orientation to JavaScript, or going from simpler web development to building a large application with JavaScript. So there are steep learning curves there, whether people are coming from the back end, into the browser, writing the application logic there, or coming from a simpler web development environment. So, and there's also many new things. This is one of the risky things, but it's also one of the really exciting things. There's many new things companies want to embrace due to a fresh start. And moving to browser-based applications and Angular and rewriting your front end and your architecture, there's this wonderful opportunity to start doing testing and continuous integration, continuous deployment, maybe more fully embracing Agile and Scrum, working closer with customers, using some of the new functional coding paradigms that are emerging with JavaScript, and the new architectures, the reactive and functional sort of approaches. These are all wonderful, but this is adding a lot to the effort. And if you get off on the wrong foot with the architecture or the process or the testing, then it's not going to work down the road. One of the biggest challenges with adopting unit testing is that you need a testable code base, which means the code base has to be written from the scratch with a good set of tests. And so if you start from scratch with a set of tests that aren't good, they become a drag on the project, and people stop writing them and running them, and unit testing is deemed to be a failure. If you write your code first and then try to test it, it's very awkward to do that. So you have to do a lot of refactoring, and if you don't do that, your tests are going to be fragile and awkward and slow down your development. And so the only real good solution for a large, unit tested code base is to start, early, and to do it right, and to make sure that you've got that momentum going, across your whole team. And so all these things are big changes to normal development practices. But not modernizing is more expensive. The loss of customers to newer mobile and UX-friendly competitors is impacting a lot of companies. A loss of customers just due to the slow delivery of new features, because you have an older architecture. You have a lot of technical debt that you're suffering through, and adding, someone asks for a drop-down on a field, on a form, and it's been 2 years and it still hasn't been implemented. Things like that, that's going to cause a steady loss of, faith in your application platform. And then a loss of customers to the perception that you are a last generation solution, and you look like you're a decade old versus, the modern applications. So the big question here is what to do. So we can effectively modernize if we, and this is our recommended practices, validate our architecture and start delivery of new features in less than 6 months. So picking that timeline. We've worked with a lot of clients that have flip-flopped on their architecture like 6 times in 12 months. They've gone from Backbone to Angular to React, back to Angular, to some hybrid mix, and they're still talking about picking an architecture. And that's going to destroy you if that's how you go about building your application. There are ways to mitigate some of that risk. So you can take a strategy where your application architecture, like the framework you use, is actually just a small part of your architecture, and you can have clean, framework independent JavaScript code as a core part of your code base. But the goal here is to get a good start. So make your decisions, lock them in, and create an environment where you can start delivering new features that excite customers and start delivering value in less than 6 months. And so we're mitigating our risk early, and we're having a steady flow of working features to clients. It's continuous delivery, and maybe not directly to production, but from developers building features to regular releases. So a lot of older companies, once you've gotten into an established customer base, they got tired of you releasing code every month, so you went to every 3 months, to every 6 months, to every 12 months, and your customer base was actually demanding that your release cycle be every 18 months because they had to retrain, upgrade, do different things. That's not the reality of what people want when you're doing something new. They want to see it earlier. They want to have some feedback. They want to see some of their requirements being met. And even if they don't, the risk is too great to do a massive rewrite and try to launch it 6 months out, 3 years out. And so you want to create a process where you are delivering features and maybe new features to clients rather than the rewrite of the old features, if you can come up with a strategy and a plan to do that. The third point is the most important. If you want to do something like this in less than 6 months, you have to leverage your existing code base effectively. Otherwise, there's just no way you can do that. You've got 10 years of development, and to rewrite it all is going to take 2 years, and that's probably going to take 3 because you're going to want to reinvent things and re-architect things and approach things differently and rethink things. And so it's just too big to bite off. So if you can come up with an architecture, figure out what you're going to deliver, and start delivering incrementally and migrating incrementally, then you have to leverage your existing code base. You're going to get the new features out, and you're going to successfully migrate without really taking too long and losing your customer base. And then, if you figured out that you can validate and start delivering new features, you're going to mitigate early risks, so you understand what your delivery process is going to be, you're going to leverage your existing code, then the last point is to train and augment your team to achieve these points. And we're going to talk a little more about that and some of the rules of thumbs and best practices that we've seen to be effective in the market. So first, to set the table, I'm going to talk a little bit about what a modernization or a modernized architecture looks like. And say you're doing an Angular application and you have a legacy system and you want to reuse the code, you need to write an API, and this is a common practice. So you're creating a headless version of your old application and you're putting an API on it. The pros of this, you get to reuse your business logic. The API code base is familiar to the team. But there are some significant challenges to this as well. The API leaks the old schema. This is unbelievably difficult to avoid. Changes are slow. One of the reasons is the API isn't a simple wrapper of old logic. All applications end up having a lot of their business rules in the UI, and so when you just start exposing back-end calls, you need to rewrite them significantly to include the business rules that were actually in a different part of the system. So the API footprint is rather different than a back-end for a traditional web application. Regressions are epidemic because you are refactoring the back end at the same time and trying to figure out how to bring in this business logic. And the new system is ultimately compromised because you're building it against the old system and you're not creating a nice clean API to drive the rapid development of your front end application. Some interesting experiences around building out this API. We've worked with clients that they thought they would have their API to us in a day, and it took, no kidding, 6 weeks, because as they dove in, it was just like going down the rabbit hole. Another client was sure they'd have it done in 2 weeks. It took 10. But one of the reasons it took 10 was they didn't realize exactly how much they had to change, and they delivered the API, and we would test it and give them feedback, and we ended up having to write a full test suite against the API that enforced the contract that we were looking for building the front end. Which raises another question. You're trying to build the front end without the API being defined or the API being unstable. You do want to decouple these as much as possible. So if you can work on your new front end features while you're working on your API at the same time, then you're not going to have that slowdown and those challenges of rapid development. So another architecture that is more common and especially becomes attractive after the initial experience of trying to build out the API is to go to a service-oriented architecture that has multiple layers. And so your legacy system, if you have that serving up its data to another application server, the legacy API can be less ideal. You can expose some of the old system behavior and some of the data model because you're going to be creating your end API for your application at a different layer. The existing team can build this much more quickly. I would say that the effort is a quarter or even less the effort of an ideal API. The new app server can be fully modern. So when you're building that middle tier, you can use Node and use new authentication mechanisms. And the front end can be built against mock data. So you can be building out your new app server for your mobile and single page applications. You can build out the mock data for it, and you can define the API that you're looking for from the back end, and those teams can work independently. And then the Angular team or the front end application team can work very rapidly and independently. Some of the other pros for this is the caching strategies are easier, and there's a good chance you can scale your legacy system horizontally when this is done by creating new instances of it. Some of the challenges are you do have a second server, there's new technologies to master, but if you really do want to take an aggressive modern caching strategy, that actually becomes a huge benefit. And so what your application architecture might end up looking like is you have your Angular application, a mobile application talking to a common application server for mobile and single page apps. It has a Redis or a Mongo database set up for caching, and it has a legacy system that it's calling through the API. And you can build and scale your new application. You can address some of the scalability issues from the past, and really leverage the value of the legacy system without having to spend too much time trying to make that value available. Your middle tier application server will make calls to that API and then wrap those in another API that's serving up the appropriate document oriented API to your new applications. So with the architecture discussion out of the way, how would we go about modernizing? What are some of the key steps that we need to go through? We talked a little bit about that, but we'll break it down a little bit more. I would say there's 5 key steps. You need the commitment, the full organizational commitment to it. Oh, look at that. All right. You need the skills in your team to be able to do that. This is a brand new type of application that's being built. It's a large scale code base being written in the browser. It's using JavaScript in ways people haven't used. It's a break from how you would previously architect applications. So there's just new ways of actually thinking about programming, and then there's new frameworks and a lot of differences. So that's an important step. Your timeline is essential. So what is the timeline that you can support to effectively not lose too much opportunity in your market and to leverage your investment in what you're doing? What's your strategy for achieving that? So what kind of tools are you going to use? What kind of staffing? And then break that down into a plan so you can start moving against this effectively without getting stuck and revisiting it every few months. So first off, from a commitment perspective, commitment is probably the hardest piece. You need management buy-in. It's very important to have the accounting and strategy lined up and everyone bought in. And so the accounting actually is very important because there's a lot of opportunity cost accounting that you can do. And if you really look at the opportunity cost of taking too long to migrate, or if you don't, then it's really clear to you what your business goals are, right? And what you need to do to actually profit and prosper in the market. Management has to be committed to this, and so having a project charter to really drive the process. From a skill perspective, we already talked about this. Front-end engineering is the better way to put it, requires a different skill set. We're not cut and pasting from Stack Overflow to add a transition or an interesting box. What we're doing is we're building a whole application with a whole architecture in the browser. So I'm just having one little problem here with my keyboard. Just give me a sec. I got it. So, the large code base in the client's a new experience. A lot of people are scared of it, so they make design decisions that don't actually make sense. So we've seen, what were supposedly browser-based applications were getting a lot of their routing and a lot of their page construction still happening on the server side for no real reason, and duplicating a lot of the code that ultimately went into Angular or the front-end application, and that added a lot of complexity to the application, and it really removed the value of building a browser-centric app. So you really want to have a separation of concerns where your application and UX logic is running in the browser, you have an API for the server, and you're really committed to that. And then finally, your new approaches, such as TDD and continuous integration, are a huge opportunity and you don't want to miss. And so that's getting your team up to speed on that. And these are all significant changes, and there's a lot of them. From a timeline perspective, understand the opportunity cost of the timeline. Once you have that in place, work from there and create your strategy and your plan around it and commit to it. having that timeline and what the meaning of that timeline is essential, and that's where we recommend putting that into a charter, so that if there are any discussions or issues, while you're trying to move the project forward, everybody has that single document to refer to and the buy-in at all levels in the company. From a strategy perspective, what are you doing to get your skills to the right place? How are you augmenting those skills? How are you architecting your new solution to account for your timeline and your skills, and how are you managing the risk? There's a few things that you can do architecturally as well. So with some companies, to bring in their new Angular features, you can do some, it sounds ugly, but you can do some nice things with iframes to build out new features. So you can be running your old application as is. You can be building the headless version with an API. You can be putting in your Node server, you can be building an Angular application, and then you can be embedding it into an iframe. There's a few other strategies that can be taken as well. We're going to talk a little bit about those as we move through the final parts of this talk. And then from your plan, right? So we strongly recommend having a clear inception phase and then a build phase. And in the inception phase, really truly identify your organizational needs, your business-driven timeline, your charter to keep everyone on the same sort of plan, and then your architecture strategy. So whether you're using iframes or how you're deploying new features, how you're coordinating everything, so that when you finally move into build, you can take a validated learning approach and have milestones that really eliminate the risk. If you can't get features to a client on your current application within 6 months, I'd say the chances of failing at this kind of a project are probably tenfold. If you can get organized and trained and everyone focused on getting those first features delivered and used in production by clients within 6 months, you've eliminated a huge amount of the risk. And that's going to be a great way to really make sure that you do successfully do this and not incur those losses that could potentially put your company at risk. So, what are some of the things, some of the thoughts, rather than just pontificate on the prior section, I just collected a set of different rules that are worth thinking about and applying to your current project or a future one. So rule 1, deliver something in less than 6 months. I can't overstate that. Rule 2, try to leverage 50% of your current code base. If you're not, code is a huge, massive investment, and if you can leverage that, you're going to be in much better shape. The urge to rewrite everything is just overpowering as an engineer, but it's also a quick road to destruction in terms of getting a new application built. So strive to get some kind of goal and use that to motivate yourself. Release new features with the new code base. This one could be written a little clearer, but rather than just rewriting old features and replacing them, you could use your new code base and your new architecture to actually start releasing some enhancements. And so, for instance, if you needed to have some kind of reporting or a dashboard or some analytics that people had wanted for a while, this would be a great new initial feature to start releasing. And we've worked with a lot of clients who've done that, where they went into their analytics and metrics and they built out that first and got their core architecture, they got their team up to speed, and then they started releasing features from the rest of their back end, and they aligned that with their putting in a service-oriented architecture that made appropriate reuse of their existing code. I talked about validated learning, so borrowing from the lean startup space, lean migration. This talk could have been framed, and maybe that would have been a better theme, but lean migration, how you can break down the project and incrementally do your migration. Because browser-based apps run in the browser, you can write a lot of stuff that can interoperate with your old code. You just need to get that API in place. We talked a bit about the challenges of doing that and what our architecture might look like. If you get the right architecture and strategy in place, then you can take a lean migration approach and validate your learning at every step and do it early. Risk-driven prioritization. If there's anything that's of high risk, then get that done earlier. And part of this is working on getting features out in the first 6 months. Rule 6 is partly psychological, but also an important one from reusing code and incrementally migrating. And this isn't often thought about as part of the core architecture. and that's include design. And so most people have older CSS frameworks, and you're moving to Angular, and you're going to do all the fancy new stuff with Bootstrap or Foundation. But what about your legacy code? So one strategy is to implement a new UI CSS framework for your legacy code. So you have your older version of your app looking a lot like where you're going with the new one. And you do a design refresh in conjunction with your new features, because design communicates to your market as much as features. And as you start releasing these new themed features, so maybe your analytics dashboard, if it fits within the new design, it looks like you have a new application, you're adding new features, and you're moving your client base over to the new app, and you can replace pieces one at a time without it being a weird mismatch of this old, decade-old look and feel and the new look and feel. Now, this could be an expensive proposition. It may be worth the effort still, depending on the scope of your application and what your milestones are and what your release cycle is going to look like. But definitely think deeply about design and how you can pull your old and new together. I mean, this is a bit trite, but be user-centric. There's two things that this really helps with. Ensure you migrate risk by the delivery of user value, but it also helps frame arguments and discussions internally, right? So if you're talking about a feature, if you're talking about what to do, if you can tie it to the value that's being delivered to the user, that can help settle the discussion. It can also help make sure that we're focused on incremental delivery of value to users, because if something's not of value in a complete feature, it's not really releasable. So, working across different projects from an allocation perspective, there's different sort of mixes, but you have to maintain your current platform. You might have to have some features. You don't want to shut that down completely. There's bugs, there's issues. So how are you going to allocate your current team? You need to build a new API. So a quarter of your team to the API would be essential. You need to support your current platform. So leave a quarter of your team on the current platform. And then take half your team, move them to the new platform, and then hire or partner for key skills to get your new team up to speed and the mitigation of risk. And so that you can get through that initial 6 months, get the architecture in place, get the team up to speed, get the testing in place, and start delivering features effectively. And then as you get closer to having parity with your prior platform, you can move your API team to the new platform. You can move your API team back to the current platform if you need to keep some things moving there. And then you'll slowly move until you have your full team working on the new platform. But this gives you the allocation of your key skills to address all of your strategic needs during the project. Rule 9, accounting. So if you have a valid business, what is the opportunity cost, the loss for not supporting mobile or having 4 code bases, old web, new web, mobile web, and apps, if not having the sort of the user experience that you're looking for, having slow development moving forward. But the key things are, now that are really pressing and making people make decisions are mobile and supporting all these platforms. And so if you can really figure out the cost of not moving now versus moving later, then you can compare that to the cost of staffing, to actually do the move and come up with a net positive, of motivation, financial motivation for actually doing the project and doing it now. And that will be one that will keep everybody focused on getting it done. Rule 10, engage your customers. Separate design refresh, early shipment of new features. We talked a little bit about this earlier. One of the traps, I mean, it's not even a trap, it's really a service to your customers, but you go from quarterly releases to, half a year to yearly to 18 months. And what you end up with is a release cycle where your clients are pretty much completely disengaged with what you're doing. And so this is a great way to get them re-engaged, to validate what you're doing, and make sure that you're getting that feedback that you need from the market, and also forcing yourself to deliver and mitigate that overall risk of doing the migration. So that is the sort of the talk in terms of some of the strategies, some of the challenges, some of the the goals in modernizing a tech stack and not going out of business. Incremental delivery, doing it in less than 6 months, allocation of your team, proper alignment within the company with the right accounting sort of practices to make sure everyone's aligned, the design strategy to support the integration of your new features with your old features, and that pretty much sums it up. So with that, we'll move to questions. And let me flip over here. And if you have any questions, you can ask them. And I will go through them. So let's have a look what we got. All right, so obviously the sound problems. Any experience with a GWT migration to Angular? Yes, that was actually one of our larger projects. So we helped the company move from GWT to Angular. They had been started on it for a couple of months, and they were struggling with two things. One was the testing, that just wasn't working out. And then they weren't sure if their architecture was the right architecture. And then they discovered the concept of continuous delivery, so they were excited about that. So they hired us to help them get testing in place and move over to a continuous delivery process. So we worked with them for about 3 months, and they went from one release in 3 months to 33 releases in a single day. And they were really excited about the end result of that, and they've moved quite successfully over to Angular. We also did a UWCSS re-architecting for them so they could have multiple applications working together, and help them with a multi-app strategy so that they could have different teams working on different Angular apps that would work together seamlessly. So be happy to discuss that with anybody. So issues with .NET. .NET's sort of interesting, and Java's interesting, and all the different platforms are interesting. One of the big challenges there is the psychology, or the what you're used to. So with .NET, there's a lot of data mapping frameworks, and there's a lot of ways of validating data and this big enterprise type stuff. And when people shift over to Angular, they're sort of horrified, to be honest. Or if they shift over to a REST API, they have this JSON data, and it's not in this monolithic sort of data mapping layer, and it's not object oriented, and it's sort of scary to them. And so they look for solutions like that. They build it out themselves within the Angular app, or they work with something like Breeze. Some apps, I think there is value in using Breeze or something like that, but for most apps, once you get used to the paradigm, and this is one of the challenges of moving over to JavaScript, it's more of a functional approach. You have a data structure that's coming over from the REST API, and you're writing functions to manipulate that data, validate that data, and rapidly connect that data to the HTML. And it's a different shift in thinking, so getting people moved over to that. Java is a similar thing. People coming from Python and Ruby tend to do better in terms of that sort of thinking style, because there's those slight functional leanings in Python and Ruby. But that shift away from an object-oriented approach to really composition of functions, which is sort of more natural in JavaScript and more powerful for consuming REST APIs. So bringing the skill set of the team up to speed, can you recommend an effective method on how to do this? The challenge is experience. So training can be effective, especially training that's centered around real-world application architecture. So the big challenge, and we do a lot of Angular work, so I'll use those examples. But some of the big challenges with early Angular projects is everything goes into the controller. People misuse root scope, and to really make the app sustainable long term, it needs to be refactored. You need a service architecture. There's a lot of core things that need to be done. So getting a good example project, getting a good start on the project. What we did in the prior, when I was talking about moving to continuous delivery and moving off GWT, we did training for a couple of days. We did training on Git, so getting a good Git and code review process is important. And then we augmented the team with one of our senior devs for a few weeks, where he worked with their team and basically looked at every single pull request and slowly increased the focus on what needed to be done in terms of what was acceptable code and what needed to be there. The team already had a few weeks or a couple of months of work done, so we also spent some time refactoring the code base. Hiring in some new skill, with that experience can be very valuable. Code reviews. So once a team gets started, that's another way that we've worked with companies, is doing a code review and giving some feedback. Sometimes a refactoring engagement, so getting them to a point where they actually have a working set of unit tests against a code base that they've been working on for a couple of months. And those are the key things. And really understanding that it's going to take a while to shift over. With all the issues coming up in Angular 2, are you guys still building in Angular 1? Do you feel safe building new apps in 1.3? So yes, we feel very comfortable building apps in 1.3. We did a webinar a couple of months ago on future-proofing your Angular applications, and we talked a lot about that. A quick recap on that was, a lot of the changes are terminology and declarative, in the sense that you're getting rid of scopes, but that's already the case in 1.3 if you're using controller as. You're getting rid of controllers, but you're not really. You're replacing them with a higher level component model where the methods are providing the controller function. A lot of the things are still there. It's just changing the way that it's specified. And the rule of thumb that I used in evaluating Angular 2 versus Angular 1.3, if I had an Angular 1.3 application, could I use a fairly junior team to migrate it to Angular 2 without it having to be re-architected and rewritten? And for the most part, the answer to that is yes. A lot of the changes are syntactical, and the bigger changes are very valuable in terms of a larger scale application architecture. So. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yeah, we got 10 minutes. I think we're getting near the end of the list of questions, so if you have any more, please ask. So what do you think about using this modern web stack, Angular? Sorry, I checked my time and Siri spoke. So what do you think about using the modern web stack, Angular, Bootstrap, SPAs, in internet applications? I've worked for a company in the banking industry. They have large apps. Yeah, I think Angular for enterprise apps is amazing because enterprise apps are about building applications rapidly against data. And the thing is, you do need, or ideally you have REST APIs for consuming the data. And so we've worked with a few companies where they have large healthcare organizations. They're moving to Angular. And the way that I've described it to other companies that are thinking about it is that Angular is almost like Power Builder for REST APIs. And if you're working with an enterprise, probably most of the management knows what Power Builder is. And it was a tool for rapidly building enterprise apps against database schemas. Then we moved to the web, and that didn't make sense anymore. Now that we've moved to REST APIs, that same paradigm actually exists, where we can rapidly build applications against data, but that data is now being served up from the REST API. And Angular is by far the fastest way of building, CRUD-based data-oriented applications against a REST API. So it's a perfect fit for internal enterprise applications for the most part. What measures can you take to insulate your application against Angular and modern web frameworks becoming obsolete? Web frameworks move fast. So a great example of this is the Ionic framework, which is actually now an Angular-based framework, but they have an interesting architecture where they have pretty much plain JavaScript that's being pulled into their Angular code for their directives and their services. And I talked to one of them about it because I thought it was great. It made it look, very clean. The JavaScript was pretty independent, and it made it clean for moving, to Angular 2. The reason they did it originally, however, was they were planning on supporting Angular, Bootstrap, and Ember. And so Ionic's a good sort of, I look at an Angular based framework that was built with the concept of being agnostic. The simplest, most important step, to simplify that, is everything should go in services. As much as possible. Your services should look like plain JavaScript. Your controller should be skinny. Your directive should be skinny. And think of your business logic as being JavaScript and writing it that way. There's a lot you can do that really doesn't impact or add any complexity to your application, and it makes it more modular. Logic that's not entangled with controller logic is more testable. If you think about services, they tend to have very few dependencies. Our CTO here actually did some proof of concept work against Angular services for reusing them in other JavaScript applications. And he created a project called Nebular, which is a way of wrapping Angular services and reusing them, so without using Angular. And it was an interesting sort of project. And so that's on the Rangle GitHub, and it's called Nebular. That's also talked about in the future-proofing webinar that we did a couple of months ago. So there would be a little more on that in there if you're interested. So it looks like that's all the questions we have, and I apologize again for the late start. We'll make that up to you by giving you a little bit of an early finish as a bonus. I appreciate you taking your time to sit with us during your lunch hour. I hope you found it interesting, and if you have any questions, follow up. You can reach me at nick@rangle.io. The bottom of the G's cut off a bit there. It's Rangle, and I'm also available on Twitter. So thanks again, and hope to see from you on another webinar.